Who are we going to pick? Well, since he's on a roll, I'm going to pick the big pipe. Now, I want to say this before we start. This is an absolutely crucial issue for all of us to look at. I know we are confronted day in and day out with the transactional responsibilities we have, trying to get somebody to come in through the front door, the right person for the right job at the right time. There is a horizon on that, and at a certain point, you're not going to be able to find the right person. It is important that we all think about investing in that now, because hopefully all of us will be there in 15 years reaping the benefits of what we sow. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Lance, and he's going to represent the big pipe session. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. We set out with a very small goal, and that was reinventing the education system. And we started by trying to come to an agreed problem statement. And I'll sort of use the liberty of presenting to sort of give my formulation of it. 50 years ago, Sputnik was launched. And it was clear to the world, and certainly to this nation, that something in the world had changed, that the U.S. needed to respond in some way. And so there was massive investment and legislation passed in science and mathematics. There were all sorts of programs to try and close that gap with the Soviet Union, which was visible. There was a dot moving across the sky. With education, we have a silent Sputnik. There's no dot moving across the sky. There's no obvious cataclysmic change. But one thing we agreed in our discussion this morning is there is a crisis. The United States faces a real problem looking to the future in that for most of our country, the education system is not working. There's no easy answer to this. We recognized we weren't going to come up with it in 2 hours, but we felt it was important to state the scale of the problem, and it is a massive problem. With that understanding of there is a key problem, we tried to go a bit deeper into, well, what is the nature of the problem? It's a multi-tiered issue. There's a part of the country, and I suspect if you have children, for most of us, it's the part of the country we live in, where the education system is wonderful here. And we have elite universities that are the best in the world. We have fabulous performing high schools. That's for an elite of the country. There's a part of the country where nothing is working, largely in the inner cities. And there's a great mass of the country, the middle class, where there is a functional educational system, but by any international standard, it is substandard. And the worrying thing is it is increasingly substandard as children move through the education system. The main international comparison of education systems, the PISA study, which is done by the OECD, at 4th grade, American children are doing very well internationally. They're maybe not the top, but they're in the top cohort. In 8th grade, they're becoming rather middling. And by 10th grade, they're poor. They're in the lower quarter of the world. So something is going clearly wrong for much of our country. In our discussion today, we sort of tried to dig into what are some of the reasons. And certainly in the room today, we think it's partly our education system is still largely a 19th century, late 19th century system. It hasn't changed with the changing world. That's a particularly tough issue for business, which obviously has had to move into the 20th and the 21st century. They're still getting the products of a 19th century education system. It's a system that assumes one size fits all, where the only talent that is valued by our education system is a highly academic talent. There isn't a value of other talents, other kinds of approaches to mind and to knowledge that might reward more of the children in our system. It's a system that doesn't reward or esteem teachers sufficiently. One data point I raised, the country that comes number one in this PISA study, Finland, it's harder to get into teacher training in Finland than it is to get into medical school because there's such demand. And it's one of the best paid professions in Finland, and it's one of the toughest professions to get into because it's seen, the teacher is highly respected at the top of sort of society's esteem. That certainly is not the case in this country. It's also a system we discussed in our discussion where the metrics we use, we're all people in the business world, and so, if you can't measure it, you can't track it. Well, the metrics we use for education increase all the distortions we talked about that are the problems. We're measuring things that maybe aren't the things we should measure. With that huge problem, what are our solutions? And here, I have to say, I think we came up with some good things, but they're much more modest than the problem would seem to suggest, because we were trying to, having had that, what we term 60,000-foot overview of the scale of the problem, we tried to come up with some very concrete things that could help actually, what can we individually do, what can business do? The belief was that one of the key factors needed was motivation and inspiration. And we heard some stories of what companies like EA are doing in terms of going out to universities and in some places to high schools and middle schools and talking about, what are the kind of careers that you can have in gaming, how you need to be really good at math, how doing engineering can open up all these possibilities to you. So trying to provide that motivation and inspiration, and certainly more companies can do that. Suggestion came up of having programs of employee sabbaticals to get skilled people from business, who are great at motivation, at facilitation, at leading teams, to get them into the classroom. We skated over the whole issue of, well, if you don't have an education certificate, in most states you're not allowed to do that. That's a problem we'll leave to be solved. The importance of lobbying government on this crucial issue for the nation's future. And then, on a slightly different note, the need for whatever the solutions that might come up, the need to have solutions that are appropriate to our national DNA, as it were. Dennis, who had a lot of business experience in Asia, if you look at Japan, at China, at Korea, at India, in some section of the Indian population, the number of hours, the number of days of school that those countries have for their children are things that we don't even approach. And so attempts to say, well, the key for America is, we got to look to Japan and we're going to increase the school year, we're going to have more homework, and it's going to be more tests and things like that. That's, I think, the general feeling in the room was that's not the path for the United States to follow. More homework isn't the solution. What this country is good at is innovation, it's at being disruptive, it's at encouraging creativity, it's at encouraging diversity, and that's one of the strengths of this country, to have diverse minds, diverse skills, diverse population, and an education system that can promote that and capitalize on that to the good of the nation as a whole.
Did you, Lance, maybe you mentioned it, but did you talk about the inhibitor unions? So just yesterday, I heard on the radio about a philanthropist who, in some community, had paid close to $500,000 to 2 different elementary schools, rewarding teachers who created better results. And basically the union was forcing that project out of their community, and community members were not happy.
We had less than 2 hours to cover it, and people did raise the resistance in many areas of teachers and teachers' unions to change. People did raise the issue of tenure as a possible barrier. In business, we're used to performance and turnover as part of what renews and can revolutionize a culture. That's, in the current system, not possible in most of education. We don't have a solution out of the box for it, but that's clearly one of the issues.
Did somebody?
Sorry.
I was just curious if you talked about centralization of education, because if you look at the tops, and I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is the very top countries in this tend to have very centralized education. If you compare to where the U.S. is really good at education, the military, it's a highly systematic, highly centralized. If you're the teacher, this is how you teach it. And it's not, algebra is defined differently in one school district than another.
We didn't talk about this. One thing I raised, because I have a background in doing some of this public policy work in the UK, which has moved to a very centralized national curriculum. That's one of the things the Blair government brought in, is to establish a national curriculum, which France has long had. And France has, in terms of international performance, a very high-performing system. It's my personal bias that one of the strengths of the U.S. should be, and I emphasize the should, the fact that education is by and large controlled at the state and even local level. So that should provide, if you think of a market economy, we should have loads of experiment and different systems, and you think that would produce some sort of, what is the fittest system rather than a singular nationally controlled thing. It's not happening. So maybe the thing to do is to go to a more centralized, I don't know.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's one best way to do it. I think that's the challenge. There may in fact be, for some things, not all things, there may be really sort of one best way to do it.
Perhaps, yeah.
I was wondering whether there was any discussion about homeschooling, which is freighted with a certain political significance these days, but can be seen as kind of the entrepreneurial response to the sort of mega big business of the public schooling system and public universities and that kind of thing, and whether are these, to the extent that small is the new big or whatever you kind of expressions you want to use, is this part of the answer to the laboratory of allowing an even more localized level of experimentation in response to all of these challenges?
We didn't talk about that. What we did talk about is that there are three key elements in the education system. There are the children, there are the teachers, and there are the parents. And one of the issues that affects the education system and affects our society at large is in communities where there is that, where you have highly educated parents and you have strong parental support, on the whole you have, whatever the deficiencies of the educational system, you have children that perform well and that are going to go on and do well. In communities where you don't have that parental support, either one-parent families or in many cases virtually no parenting at home, or inadequate resources, or someone raised that I think in the San Jose schools, 23% of children are coming to school with severe toothache because they don't have dental insurance, and so so how can you learn in those conditions? And so there are very big issues there.
Great. We're going to cut
Move
off
on.
there.
We're covering a lot of different topics, but if we come out of this and there's any kind of press release or press activity, this would be one that maybe, where we're making statements around this issue from this group, may be of value.
Yeah,
it would be very interesting to see that.
I would agree. I think the important point here, given the enormity of this problem, is that if you had come to a meeting like this in 2003 and somebody had stood up and said, all we need to do is get the top 10 CEOs in the nation to demand mandatory carbon caps from the federal government, everyone would have laughed that speaker out of the room. No questions asked. And that just happened last week, because business can get their mind around the fact that if they don't invest in the right things, that they're going to have problems later on, but also there's market opportunities based on that investment and based on that engagement. Yeah.
It's just a trade-off. I think the challenge right now is, do we mobilize against, I don't think that one issue is bigger than the other, but I think the two issues are health and education.
Right.
So the question is what's the burning platform today? Because I don't think we can get the CEOs to really mobilize against both issues as aggressively as we need to. And so I think that this one may be a way that we can start to push the dial with things like Teachers America, that program that they have. There's some other things that I don't know, but I see both of those things are they're huge burning platforms, and we've got to fix them both.
It's an excellent point. And at the end of the day, from a business perspective, it both comes down to disposable income. If we don't invest in education today, the amount of tax dollars we will spend to try to cover the shortfall of people who can't work or otherwise can't contribute, those tax dollars will be coming directly out of the P&L of our companies. It's just a disposable income issue. The same thing with healthcare. Every dollar that's going into healthcare can't be turned to stuff that might be more beneficial. Yeah, Kevin.
In the spirit of the unconference, the afternoon session for this business and education thing is not scheduled, but we're kind of calling an audible on it. There are a number of people that are still interested in it, and you guys can switch your tracks, I guess. And if you want to do that, meet with Dennis at lunch. Dennis, stand up again, please. So meet with Dennis at lunch, and we could continue this because the afternoon's still open. We still have the room reserved and so forth.
Right, and we not only have the room open, but if more people want to, we can come up with other facilities. Christine's point is a great point. There's not a shortfall of large social issues on the CEO's agenda that they have to take a look at. But the way we can each make a contribution to this is to not shut up about it. Bottom line is, if we sit in every HR meeting or CEO meeting or business meeting and say, we got to address this, and here's market opportunities for us by virtue of that, this issue will start to be raised. And then 5 years from now, when everyone says, there's no way we're going to get CEOs to move en masse to try to solve the education problem, it'll be the same thing as 5 years ago saying there's no way to get CEOs to move en masse on the carbon issue.
Amen, Jeff.
Hallelujah!